Sofia, if you could, Steve, if you could turn off sharing, right? And Sofia, if you could share your screen and get ready for your presentation. I see you're there. Sofia Karabatsos just completed her master at the University of Alberta, and she's going to tell us what she's done about analyzing the historic distribution of bighorn sheep across the range in Alberta. Sofia, take it away.
Okay, let me just set up over here. All right. Well, thank you, Marco. I hope everyone can hear me all right. And thank you to everyone who came to this presentation, where I'll be talking to you a little bit about the research that I've been conducting over the past few years, studying winter bighorn sheep distribution trends across the Alberta Rocky Mountain range. So to start off, I want to tell you a little bit about the value of long-term monitoring data. Its main one being that it can track general trends over a long period of time. If trends are detected, we can then start to ask the question as to why, for example, our population is changing over time. So whether it's increasing or decreasing over time, and what are certain factors that most influence that population change. That can then allow us to better forecast for future trends and modify our management plans so that they can better protect that population at risk. So all of this can then feed back into the long-term data collection practices so that they can better answer the questions that we want to ask in the future. This is where I come in. In my case, I have about half a century of Albertan bighorn sheep data that was collected aerially as count data one day during the winter season. And you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner a sample of that data that was collected in the earlier periods. And this was before there was actually a GPS, so wildlife biologists were required to identify sheep on the landscape location manually. So that data was then digitized and unified with the more recent data sets that are already on Excel spreadsheets and stuff, so that we can have a larger scope of bighorn sheep distribution over time. So you might be wondering why we want to study distribution. What can distribution really tell us about a population? Well, clusters of a population on the landscape can be indicative of the influence of a variety of factors within their environment on that population. Factors like predation, competition for resources, foraging opportunities, natural disturbances, and human developments in the area. The objective of the study was to determine where and how bighorn sheep are distributed over the winter landscape and how that distribution is changing over the 50-year time period. We also want to know how ewe and ram distributions differed from one another. And you'll see on the map to the right, my study area is located in blue, or shown in blue, and it did not include national or provincial parks in the area. So the study area was divided into wildlife management units, which are regions designated by the government for monitoring and management purposes. For bighorn sheep, that meant they were surveyed, or these WMUs were surveyed biannually. However, due to the influence of a variety of factors from year to year, changes in weather, landscape, accessibility issues, or finances that change from year to year, some WMUs were surveyed more frequently than others, as seen on the map to the right, where WMUs in red were surveyed more frequently and WMUs in yellow were surveyed less frequently in the end. So this ultimately creates gaps within the coverage of the study area over the time. So how do you deal with this type of bias that presents itself? Well, first, it's important to acknowledge that this kind of bias exists frequently with long-term data sets, simply because of, for example, changes in staffing from year to year, the changes in conditions, or changes in budget from year to year, as mentioned earlier. Second is to account for the sampling bias in some way. In my case, I grouped the years into 3 main time periods, which allowed me to account for the majority of WMUs in each of those time periods to make the most of the study area that I have. Second is I use a weighted fraction data set, which essentially extrapolated from the number of sheep seen in a given WMU based on a number of sheep seen in that WMU in years when it was surveyed. To study distribution spatially, I used two different analysis approaches on ArcGIS, which varied slightly in their identification of a cluster on the landscape. The density analysis assessed the proximity of individual sheep to other individual sheep in the area. It rated that proximity and then used it to develop a density function, which is used to assess the probability of seeing a sheep within a certain cell area. The hotspot analysis, on the other hand, assesses not only the proximity of individuals to one another, but also assesses the proximity of significant clusters to other significant clusters on the landscape. It then rates that proximity and then uses that to classify them as either a hotspot or a cold spot, where a hotspot means that essentially these clusters are close together, and a cold spot means these clusters are far away from one another. These two spatial analysis techniques were used for all the years put together and for the 3 time periods separately for total sheep, ewes, and rams. To assess distribution change over the 3 time periods, I used 2 different analyses, one for hotspot and one for density. For the hotspot analysis, I calculated the change in the number of hotspots that had kept their status between the 2 time periods and presented that as a percentage, where 100% would mean that all the hotspot cells stayed the same between 2 time periods, and 0% means that none of the hotspot cells had stayed the same. In this example over here, 16.5% of the hotspot cells had stayed the same between the early period to the middle period. For the kernel density analyses, I used a correlation analysis approach, which basically identified how similar the maps are to one another, where a correlation of 1 meant that the 2 maps are identical, and a correlation of 0 meant the 2 maps are completely different from one another. So across all the years, we saw clusters of bighorn sheep, ewes, and rams on the landscape. And you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner a legend which shows you essentially whether or not it was what classification of cold spot, hot spot is on the landscape, and the confidence level associated with that classification. All cubes in white were not significant, which means that it was random. The sheep were randomly distributed in that area. Most notably, we saw that ewe clusters seem to have changed the most from its northern distribution in the early period to more southern distributions in the middle and recent periods, as seen by the change in hotspot analysis, which showed 0% of the hotspot cells had stayed the same between the early and middle and early and recent periods. In comparison, ram clusters seem to have stayed relatively similar, consistent across the 3 time periods relative to ewes. When comparing the hotspot analysis to the density analyses, we see that the density analysis maps are far more difficult to extract specific locations where sheep are clustered on the landscape. In other words, they seem to be very well distributed across the entire range. And this is likely because the density analysis is a far more liberal approach to identifying a cluster on the landscape in comparison to hotspots. And given the scale of the study area, it may not be very useful to use the density approach in comparison to the hotspot for identifying cluster change, for example, over time. So overall, we see that sheep are clustered over space in the winter. We also see that sheep clusters are changing over time. And lastly, we notice that ewe clusters seem to be changing more so over time in comparison to ram clusters. So going back to an earlier diagram, I want to stress that this research was intended to start a conversation about bighorn sheep distribution trends across a large space like the Alberta Rocky Mountain range and over a long period like 50 years, and was not intended to assess causation for these trends. However, having identified changes in distribution, we can then start to ask the question as to why bighorn sheep are clustered on the landscape and why are bighorn sheep clusters changing over half a century. So in this next section, I'll propose certain factors that may be influencing sheep distribution change based on previous research. So for example, sheep have been bighorn sheep have been shown to be particularly sensitive to changes in climate from year to year. For example, snow cover depth, where they require a certain amount of snow cover that allow them to escape predation and maneuver on the landscape during the winter, while also allowing the vegetation to be preserved so that they can access it in the winter months. Therefore, we can expect that maybe climate may be affecting how sheep are distributed or how sheep distribution is changing over a 50-year time period. We also noticed an increase in wildfires over the past few decades, and studies have shown that bighorn sheep movement, for example, might be influenced by the presence of fire-affected areas within their range. As such, we can expect that maybe wildfire or fire-affected areas may be influencing how sheep are distributed as well over space. And lastly, anthropogenic factors or anthropogenic developments, such as, for example, linear features or mining activities, is prevalent across their entire range in the Alberta Rocky Mountains. And studies have shown, for example, in the north, that bighorn sheep may be attracted to mine activities, for example, possibly because of the steep cliffs and steep walls that they provide, or open landscapes. And as such, anthropogenic developments may also be influencing how sheep are distributed over space and over time based on the presence of these developments. Lastly, within our study, we also saw that ewe clusters seem to be changing more so over time in comparison to rams. And this was particularly unexpected given the understanding that ewes are far more philopatric to certain areas in comparison to rams. As such, better understanding factors that would be influencing ewe distribution in comparison to ram distribution would be interesting to look at in the future. So, like many studies, this study comes with its own slew of limitations associated with the surveying practices used, as mentioned earlier, and the spatial analysis techniques used. For example, the surveying protocol requires not only identifying sex, but also age classes, which it may be particularly difficult to assess accurately from a great distance. For example, an adult ewe may look very similar to a young ram from a large distance or from very far away. As such, we found it difficult to confidently include this kind of information in our study, and we may not recommend that this kind of information continue to be collected in the future, given the style of surveying technique used, being aerial surveys. Furthermore, one of the greatest hurdles that we had to overcome during this project was the inconsistency in the surveying that was done over time. On the graph to the right, for example, you'll see WMU on the y-axis and year on the x-axis, and each green rectangle indicates whether or not that WMU was surveyed during that year. And basically, there have been years where many WMUs were surveyed, and we get a bigger scope or a bigger view of distribution for that year. And there are other years where very few WMUs are surveyed, and we get a very patchy view of distribution for that year. Now, we did try to account for this type of these types of holes that exist within the data set, in ways that I had mentioned earlier. But we want to stress that consistency of surveying tech practice would be far more important in comparison to frequency, of surveying practice in the future. And finally, the spatial analysis techniques used did not actually consider the effect of elevation, which could be important when studying, for example, ewe and ram distribution separately, since research has shown that ewes and rams may be preferring different elevations during the non-mating season. As such, possibly taking a modeling approach in the future, which includes elevation as a factor, would be interesting to better understand how elevation is influencing ewe and ram distribution separately. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. David Hick and Dr. Annie DeRoche for their supervisory roles during this, my master's and during this research project. I'd also like to thank Dr. Majid Iravani for his consistent support and his direction during the analysis and the writing stages. I'd like to thank the Government of Alberta management teams for helping me access the data from across the Albertan Rocky Mountain range, and for helping me digitize that data so that I can use it for this research and get 50 years of data. I'd also finally like to thank the labs I've been a part of that have helped me academically and personally. And I'd like to thank you for coming out to these presentations today and for listening to the type of research that's happening currently in the sheep and goat world. Thank you. With that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sophia. Excellent example of how long-term data are important, but also how it's important to use new techniques to extract new information from this long-term data. Anybody have a question for Sophia? Please type it into the question and answer. While people are busy getting their typing finger ready, I have a couple of questions. The scale at which you presented cluster seemed to be much greater than the scale at which we expect particular ewes to move. Can you talk a bit more about there seem to be very few clusters over the whole province, about the process that you use to select, what scale you would call something a cluster?
Okay. So I assume you're talking more so about the hotspot analysis?
Yes, the hotspot.
Right. So the hotspot analysis, I used an optimized hotspot analysis approach, which essentially calculates for you, based on the data set that you have, what is considered the minimum threshold proximity for being considered a cluster. So a hotspot analysis is a far more conservative approach to identifying a cluster on the landscape, in that it not only assesses the proximity of individuals. In other words, it first uses the proximity of individuals to assess what is considered a cluster or not. And then what it does is it takes those clusters, and compares those to one another. So the optimized hotspot analysis approach differs in that it assesses itself what is considered a cluster, essentially.
Okay. We have a question from Grant Chapman, and he wants to know whether you can be a bit clearer on how you account, or you could account, for changes in survey effort, and for example, not serving areas that had very small sheep populations.
Mm-hmm. So there were two ways that I did this. One was by grouping the years into three main time periods. By grouping them into big periods, I tried to account for the majority of WMUs in each of those periods to make the most of the study area, essentially, to get a bigger picture of the entire study area. If I had grouped it into smaller time periods, I would be at risk of missing a lot of information about the different WMUs. So that would make it harder to look at the entire study area over time. That was one of the ways that I did it. The other way was that I used a weighted fraction data set. So in that way, I basically estimated how many sheep would possibly be in that area in that year, based on how many sheep were seen in that WMU in previous years. This is the way that I found was the best way to account for holes within the data set post-surveying. But the other purpose of this research was also to stress the importance of consistency in surveying as well. So this was something that I wanted to stress at the end of the project, was how important consistency was for having basically confidence in the results that you get.
Great, thanks, Sophia. There's more questions coming up in the chat, but we're running out of time, so we'll have to go on to the next presentation. But please do have a look at the chat. The question and answer, and you can answer those questions directly. I really encourage people to use the chat. You can even type in a question during the presentation, so if you're an old fart like me, you're less likely to forget it. So thanks again, Sophia. If you could unshare your screen.